But several years ago, I was walking through Forest Park. That's a big park. I think it's bigger than Central Park in New York, and it's right near Washington University School of Medicine, where I teach. That's in St. Louis, by the way, not Washington. And saw a bird feather in the ground. I picked it up. I don't know. I'll bet everybody in this room has picked up a bird feather once or twice in your life. If you're not, I mean, you see it on the ground, you pick it up. Then what do you do with it? Well, what, you put it in your pocket? I mean, I'll bet several of you have done this. You put it in your pocket. Then what do you do with it? Oh, it goes through the wash or whatever. But there's something about a feather. You just think you ought to maybe hang on to it, particularly if it's a blue jay feather or something, kind of pretty. And so I put the feather in my pocket. And it just happened that day that I was on the scanning electron microscope. This is an instrument that can magnify things hundreds of thousands of times in 3D. I put the feather under there and started cranking up the old power. And I'll tell you, I had to get out of the room. The feather, unlike everything else I'd been looking at, was so simple that I was able to begin to grasp something of its complexity. Does that make sense? You look at the brain, it looks like about 1.5 liters of fudge, and it thinks. But you look at a feather, and the parts are just sort of out there for you to look at. It's so simple that our minds can begin to grasp its complexity. Most things are so complex we don't even get to the beginning. I spent 34 years studying the human body, which you believe you're going to find is difficult to believe. But by the end of 34 years of studying the human body, I actually reached a point where I began to just get a little glimmer and a little grasp of how little I knew. It took that long to get that far. But the feather was simple enough I could think, oh my, this is just wonderful. And I thought, I'm just going to take a lot of pictures and go around the country showing these pictures and letting people enjoy. So that's what I do in the whole creation movement. I just revel, if that's the right word for it, revel in the handiwork of God. And I'll turn on the projector here, and we'll talk about birds. Now, birds are remarkable creatures. I think you've all been very impressed with birds as you go out into nature. Around here in the West, you have so many different kinds of birds. And we have already heard something about birds today, something about their flight, that mussels actually control the feathers of birds. I've mentioned this to a lot of people, and they think, wow, is that possible? And then I say, have you ever seen a peacock? They say, yeah. You see the peacock spread its tail? Yeah. What's that tail made out of? Feathers? How do you think they got all those feathers out there to fan them out? There's a mussel on every feather. Indeed, as we'll see, there's a mussel on every single primary feather on every bird. It's not just those two out in the ends, although they must have some very well-developed muscles indeed. Why talk about feathers and fur? Well, I'll leave that up for you to figure out. I do a whole lecture on a hair, by the way, because one hair is so complicated. It manifests the glory of God. And I get so excited about this stuff, I may leave the ground once in a while a little bit. Just bear with me. I don't know if these are going to be bright enough with the lights on. There's a distinguished ornithologist by the name of Olin Sewall Pettengill, in his book Ornithology, Laboratory, and Field, said one recognizes birds because they are formed to fly. Everything about their body, they have just one reproductive organ, one testis, one ovary, not two, cuts the weight down. Everything you can do to reduce weight to make streamline. People have looked at birds and wish they could fly. A lot of the people that lived on this island out here wish they could fly like the birds. You recognize that island? That's Alcatraz Island. In San Francisco Bay, the birdman of Alcatraz certainly thought a great deal of birds. But truly it may be said, birds are creatures that are just literally formed to fly. And an important part of the ability of a bird to fly is its feather. By the way, this is an interesting way to take a picture of a feather. I put the feather on a Xerox machine and Xeroxed it. And there it is. But feathers are unique to birds. I don't care what you read in National Geographic. Feathers are unique to birds, and we're going to kick the gong around seriously on that National Geographic view that birds and dinosaurs are really one and the same. Dinosaurs, you've heard this. Dinosaurs are not extinct. Even as we speak, they're feeding in our bird feeders. We'll look at that. I believe they are absolutely unique to birds. They're certainly lightweight, and yet they're very strong for their weight. They waterproof the bird. Ducks can swim in the water by reason of the fact that the feathers are waterproof. They don't grow out of the follicle waterproof, but there's a gland right back here, sort of on the rump of most birds, the uripygial gland, and the bird will take its beak and stir around in that gland and pick up a oily substance. The bird then grooms the oil into the feathers by sort of biting and pulling its feathers and what have you of its wings and other parts of its body. And in this way, the feathers get covered with an oil to make the bird waterproof. Now, there's a couple of birds that don't have a uripygial gland, and they're really interesting. The cormorants and the anhinga that you see down in Florida. How many of you ever see an anhinga walk into the water? It's kind of weird. As they go into the water, they just sort of sink. They don't float. They actually get into the water. They get sopping wet. Sort of like when you get your clothing all wet, you know how heavy your clothes are. Your T-shirt weighs like about 2 pounds when it's sopping wet. Well, these birds like the anhinga do not have the oil gland. They can't oil their feathers. Their feathers get sopping wet. It certainly makes it nice for staying in the water and fishing. They can kind of walk around and get the fish. The only problem is, when they're done fishing, they come out of the water, they actually have to sit on a log down there in the Everglades, and they first put one side to the sun, they hold their wings out, and then they put the other side to the sun, and they dry out. And during that time, they magically change names from anhinga to alligator bait. Now, feathers conserve body heat. You know that. Down jackets are very warm. And some evolutionists used to suggest that that's why feathers evolved, was to conserve body heat. But it turns out that this idea did not last very long. It was considered perfectly ludicrous by most evolutionists because there are much simpler ways to conserve body heat than feathers. For example, hypodermal fat. Fat just under the skin is very effective. I have a 29-week of gestation old grandson. Do we have a half hour to talk about my grandson? And my grandson was born premature. He weighed 2 pounds 4 ounces at birth, and then he went back to under 2 pounds, and the skin just sort of hung on his little body, and he had almost no hypodermal fat. And that's why they put the babies in the incubators, not because they can't generate body heat. They can generate just as well as any other individual for their size, but they don't have enough cutaneous fat to keep the heat in the body. Until they do, they have to keep the premature babies in an incubator. So fat conserves body heat, and birds are not fatty animals. I mean, you know, you get a really overweight bird, it's not flying, right? So birds manage to keep their body fat down quite a bit, although there is some fat in the skin, but they use feathers, a very complicated way of staying warm. You better have another use for feathers besides staying warm if you're going to go to all the trouble to make a feather. This is an interesting function. I don't think any of you have probably thought of this. Maybe some of you have. But birds actually excrete waste products of